South and the Minnesota Historical Society. Our subject tonight is reimagining policing from a grassroots perspective in two cities, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Before we start, I want to recognize that wherever we are right now, we are on Native land. In stories of the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk people. Acknowledge these people, unique connections to, and ongoing stewardship of these lands. And now on to our program. We'll begin with brief historical snapshots of Charlotte and Minneapolis with policing. Then we will move to the conversation moderated by Dr. Tekla Ali Johnson. We hope you draw new ideas, information, and insights from this evening's discussion.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm Dr. Willie Griffin, staff historian of Levine Museum of the New South. Because we are in the South, the relationship between African Americans and law enforcement has always been one of contention. Historically, law enforcement in North Carolina and the Charlotte region has always been a way to restrict African Americans' activities and control their labor. The modern police department traces its formal origins back to the post-Civil War period, when surprisingly, the city's police force consisted of both Black and white police officers. This experiment did not last long, however, because of the restrictions placed upon African American officers, which prevented them from detaining or arresting whites who violated crimes. The presence of African Americans on the police force lasted until 1868, when a white former Confederate soldier was killed by a black police officer named John T. Schenck. Not until 1940 would blacks serve on the police force again. Yet they would still have to fight for the right to police white civilians who broke laws. In the period between Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, and the turn of the 20th century, the relationship between police and the Black community became increasingly strained. Now, this was largely due to the growth of convict leasing, or what some people refer to as the chain gang system. Mecklenburg County became the first in the state to have a permanent chain gang in 1885. Majority Black convicts built and repaired roads. The state prisons and convict camps were run by former Confederate officers like Captain W.T. Laughinghouse, who was the superintendent of the state prison in 1910s. Laughinghouse wrote that the pool of potential Black convicts are young, strong, able-bodied men. The criminal courts tried between 25 to 30 men in Charlotte for crimes every term. And every strong, able-bodied man whose sentence is less than 10 years is sent to the public roads of the county. Charlotte Mayor Charles Bland wrote that he believed that the good roads which had been constructed in the county have been one of the greatest factors in building up the city. Quote, "I believe good roads are an earmark of civilizations," he stated. As more and more state officials came to adopt these kinds of beliefs, North Carolina moved to consolidate the State Highway Commission and the State Department of Prisons. By the 1920s, convict leasing had become such an important part of the local labor force, so much so that police harassment had become commonplace in the Black community. Because of this policy of over-policing in the Black communities, there were often violent clashes between African Americans and police. White police officers often found themselves in precarious situations. There were at least two such cases in the 1920s, one in 1924 and another in 1929. It had become customary that if a Black man killed a white police officer, he could expect a swift death sentence. But the incident in 1929, when Clyde Fowler shot and killed Officer Edgar Corral, who had entered his residence in the middle of the night without identifying himself, it was different. Black Charlotteans this time were fed up with having officers burst into their homes unannounced and sought assistance from the NAACP, and they made their dissatisfaction known to public officials. This was the first instance in which we see local African Americans organize against the policy of over-policing in their communities. The NAACP hired a lawyer who argued that the officer broke protocol for not reading a warrant before he entered Fowler's home. And the officer also had a history of killing Black suspects. Now, this argument did not get Fowler acquitted. Instead, the jury convicted him of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in jail. But it marked the first time in North Carolina history that a Black man accused of killing a white police officer was not sentenced to death. By the mid-1930s, convict leasing came to an end in Mecklenburg County after the national NAACP instigated an investigation that exposed inhumane conditions and treatment in convict laborers' camps. Despite these earlier victories, and even with the eventual hiring of Black police officers in the 1940s, Charlotte's Black community continues to struggle with law enforcement tendencies to police their communities and view African Americans in general as potential dangerous threats to justify the lethal force. Yet these early instances of African Americans organizing around over-policing is an important in light of the emergence of Black Lives Matter movement in more recent years, because it lets us know that policing has always been an issue in the Black community. It is not a recent phenomenon that emerged with social media. In the past, the purpose for over-policing tactics served to fill a local labor need. Today, these tactics serve as a political tool that allow politicians to boisterously call for over-policing as a way to show their potential constituents that they value law and order and are tough on crime. I look forward to the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. Despite Minneapolis's longstanding reputation for liberalism, both history and recent events suggest a much more complicated and troubling experience for many residents of the city. And of course, the rest of the nation got to see that in May and June of this year, 2020. But the events around the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police earlier this year have a more deeply rooted history. There's a history here in Minneapolis of a correlation between race and impoverishment. This is something that has been here in Minneapolis for a long time, and policing, in particular racialized policing, has also been a significant and powerful experience shaping the daily lived experiences of both African American and American Indian communities, as well as other communities of color in Minneapolis. And here in Minneapolis, racialized policing is in many ways sanctioned and supported by the city's police union, as is true in other cities across the United States. And the city's police union has long played an outsized role in Minneapolis politics. Now, that in and of itself has a long history. The police union started to become a political power in Minneapolis in the 1950s. But things weren't truly cemented in terms of the police union's place in city politics until the end of the 1960s. In 1969, the head of the police union in Minneapolis, a man named Charles Stenvig, was elected mayor of Minneapolis. And he ran on a law and order platform, one that was in many ways a reaction to uprisings from people of color in Minneapolis in 1966 and 1967, uprisings that themselves were not only the result of segregation in housing and segregation in employment, usually informal in some cases, in other cases formal through racial covenants when it came to residents, as well as police brutality. And the breakdown in community relations between the citizens of Minneapolis and the city's police had begun long before 1969. But when Charles Stenvig became mayor and ran on a platform in which he argued that the handcuffs should be taken off the police, a certain understanding of policing in Minneapolis was made concrete. In 1969, Minneapolis's largely white working class population voted to put Stenvig in office. In 1971, when Stenvig stood for re-election, he ran against Minneapolis's leading civil rights figure, a person named Harry Davis. Harry Davis had served on the school board. He'd served as the leader of many different civil rights organizations in town. And as an African-American man, he had grown up in the city. He had grown up in this majority white space and understood how the city worked. In fact, Harry Davis had the backing of the Democratic Party, the newspapers, many business people, as well as African Americans and other people of color in the city. But in 1971, Minneapolis voters decided to keep Charles Stenvig in office and to keep ensuring that racialized policing would in fact define the daily experiences for people of color in the city. And that race in 1971, over 70% of Minneapolis voters decided to keep Stenvig in office. And the two key features of that 1971 mayoral campaign, in which Stenvig again ran as an independent, neither Democrat nor Republican, over 70%. The two defining issues were school desegregation and racialized policing. So the story of George Floyd in Minneapolis has a much longer trajectory, a much longer history, a much deeper history that's directly related to long-standing practices and the long-standing power of the police union backing racialized policing in the city of Minneapolis. And I look forward to the conversation that we're about to have.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Tekla Ali Johnson, a historian of Africana and African American history at the University of South Carolina Union and at Johnson C. Smith University here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Here with me today from North Carolina first are Tiffany Fant, partner with Charlotte for Black Futures, as well as a leader with the nonprofit Soul Nation. Kristie Puckett-Williams, a leader in the statewide campaign for smart justice at the ACLU of North Carolina. Welcome. And from Minneapolis, from the Turtle Mountain Band of the Chippewa, Dillie, and y'all correct me if I pronounce your names incorrectly, please. A street outreach worker from the American Indian Development Corporation, and Sheila Nezhad, Minneapolis-based organizer with the Reclaim the Block and the MPD 150 project. We also have with us Octavia Smith, welcome, who is Emeritus Board President of the Minnesota Freedom Fund. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for coming on tonight. The format for tonight's panel is that I will ask each of you a question with maybe a follow-up question, depending upon the initial question, along with some questions, a couple questions for the group at large, if there are any takers for those. And we may also possibly get a question or two from the listening audience. And so that would be the format. Before we begin, a few statistics, recent statistics from the Washington Post as of August 25th, 2020, that there were 119 fatal police shootings last year. But what is not counted there is an NBC News report that says there were 500,000 instances of use of force. In the last 5 years, there have been 5,000 Americans shot to death by the police. This is according, again, to the documented ones. And I say that because, according to the Washington Post, again, it is voluntary for police departments to provide this information to the FBI. So the Post has, in the last 5 years, they've been keeping data, have had to use social media, have had to use police reports going on their own because they're not getting all of it. But this is what they know of. That is 1,318 Blacks, 980 Hispanics, 2,527 whites. Per million, it looks like this: 32 African Americans or Black people, 13 white people. Just looking at those two groups for just a second, we don't have all the statistics on all of the groups, but we do know that New Mexico, Alaska, and Oklahoma are states that happen to be among the states with the largest number, or in the top 10 of First Nation people, also have the highest number of police killings, with the majority being age 20 through 40 and 95% being male. So I just wanted to kind of create a little context for our discussion by framing it with some of those statistics. As we say, those are probably way under, because that's only what the police departments have provided. We want to start tonight here in North Carolina with Tiffany Fant. And Tiffany, am I saying your last name correctly?
Fant or Fant, depends
Fant,
on
okay,
where
very
you're from.
good. Tiffany Fant. Let's talk about you for a second and just how you came to the work. You have been described as a community catalyst for change, serving to empower the community for over a decade here in North Carolina. Can you provide some insight into your youth programs and how you see them now at this particular moment, where many youth have become politicized, being out in the streets, protesting, and indeed, some of them even coming to believe that protesting is a way to save their own lives and that of their families and other people of color?
As far as programming for youth, I'll work on a local level and a statewide level. And a lot of our programming or work is designed for Soul Nation is around introducing young people to access to technology around green and climate justice issues. So we work with a younger demographic. But when we start talking about NC Block, we have what's called Black University, where that's our college age students who are engaged in the political, on the political front at predominantly HBCUs and dealing directly with the issues that affect them. And protesting is a way to save our lives. Like a lot of people want to try to disconnect the movement, protesting versus having negotiations versus dealing with city council or county, but all of it needs to be done together. Like I don't make a distinction. It's all necessary, even if it's not peaceful. Like peaceful protests, like that term irritates a part of my soul. So I am excited that our young people are engaging and using their voices and their bodies in ways that we hadn't seen since the 60s and the civil rights that we learned about, right? So that's why I find it so disheartening. It's like, this is what we learned. This is what we know. So we're doing the things that we've seen and now it's a problem. So so a lot of the programming, so I'm a supporter, especially about educating and want to do more around how to make sure you're doing it well and strategically to make sure you do survive the encounter to live a little bit longer.
I have a follow-up question, a comment and a follow-up question. Yes, I remember the decision. I'm dating myself, but I was in college during the apartheid movement, and I was involved in it. And I remember there being a decision where, you know, we know we're going to get in terms of the African National Congress and other PAC, the other freedom fighters there. We know we're going to get more criticism, and we may lose part of the, I guess, for lack of a better word, the middle class or the, you know, people who have this respectable relationship still with the government if we begin to attack, you know, not attack people, but to move the movement to where you know, there's buildings that are involved and, you know, there's other signs of protest. And I remember that being a big deal and being sort of a bridge that they felt they had to cross, you know, as their movement went forward. So what you're saying there, I understand it. Now, as such, you know, you have a relatively new organization, I think, but you won a major victory this summer already here with the Charlotte City Council. Can you talk about that and how you did it?
Oh, I guess you're talking about Charlotte for Black Futures.
Yes, yes.
Yes, and that was a coalition as a direct response to what we saw happening with George Floyd, right? And we've seen coalition happening as a direct response to killings before. So that wasn't a new movement per se, a new action, let me say it that way. However, but this one was a little bit more comprehensive because we had the key people that were out in the streets protesting for us to say, we support you and we're going to do our part and we're going to continue on and this is long term. So we had a lot of ands instead of the moments.
And when you move that into the city council meeting, what happened with the tear gas? I guess is what I'm wanting everybody to know about.
Oh, the tear gas. Well, now I wouldn't say that was a direct response from Charlotte for Black Futures, right?
They credit you. The news credits you with that.
They credit us? Okay, great. You'll find that I don't watch a lot of news either. But I think it's partly because when you see somebody like Kristie, who not is only a comrade, but a friend, that is personal, right? So I think a lot of people don't want to recognize that it's personal,
right?
To see and hear and have to talk about. So what we did was to be vigilant in gathering people, the usual suspects, the unusual suspects, and say, we are all here and we're saying the same thing. So whether you're going to the streets or you're going to a boardroom or you're going to someone whom you find respectable, we are all saying the same thing. And I think that's the difference that we haven't seen a lot in our movements.
Excellent, excellent. And so the audience knows they were able to get the city council to pass, I don't know, was it a resolution or what it was, but to defund the tear gas element of the police. So the police won't have tear gas this upcoming year to disperse upon protesters. So that's,
Yes.
I think that's huge. We're great. And it's also a great example for other cities that that you did that and how you got that done and what pressure was brought to bear. So I think you have even a city council member who's out with you guys and everything. So,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Braxton, yes.
Yes. Okay. Let's go now. Go ahead and go to Kristie Puckett-Williams, also of North Carolina and the ACLU. Ms. Puckett-Williams, we know that you've been involved in legal work against mass incarceration. Can you talk about the relationship between the systemic racism that we see in the killing of unarmed Black and other people of color by agents of the state, namely the police, and systemic forces involved in the mass incarceration of predominantly brown and Black people? Is there a connection?
Definitely. The police are the gateway to all of this harm that you just described. So whether it's the state-sanctioned violence through the use of incarceration and placing people in cages, or through the use of police brutality. It's the over-policing, it's the over-criminalization of poverty, the criminalization of people's substance use disorders and things like that. And so all of that plays a role in the way that Black folks are treated, the way that poor folks are treated in our communities. And so the harm that we see, we have individual assessments of harm in our community, but we never really assess the harm that the system plays. And so the system is the most violent feature of our community. It is not the individual acts of violence that people have between each other. It is the violence of poverty. It is the violence of white supremacy, the violence of anti-Blackness. All of that is violent. And so we generally, as a society, don't name those things as violence. But if I hit you, now we have a name for that. It's assault, and that's violent, without ever looking to the way that the system creates, sustains, perpetuates, and maintains the violence. And the police are the purveyors of that violence. And they are, I would say, one of the largest symptoms that we see coming out of capitalism and white supremacy. The police is the biggest factor in my community.
Anti-colonialists Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon would agree with you, and we had thought we were past this, or many of us thought we were past this point in colonialism or neo-colonialism. But as you bring it back up and you explain it in that context, it makes perfect sense. As a follow-up, can you speak briefly about two other things? But the first one is human rights issues surrounding the treatment of incarcerated women. I know that's a specialty of yours, and what support we can provide there, wider support for families of incarcerated persons. But I'll go ahead and give you the second part of that too. Whether current strategies are sufficient right now to help those arrested within the current movement in the Black Lives Matter protest and movement for freedom, given the current federal administration's actions in Portland, Rochester, Chicago, and other places, Charlotte, Minneapolis, LA. What are your thoughts on any of those?
Well, to speak to the conditions of incarceration for women, especially, or people who are pregnant, the jails and prisons weren't built with women and girls in mind. And so the literal facilities aren't sufficient for women and girls, right? But if you are pregnant and find yourself incarcerated, there are a number of human rights violations that you will experience. You will be shackled. Oftentimes during any type of transport, you will be shackled. You have the potential to be shackled while you're pregnant. If you have the baby while you're in state custody, if you don't have anyone to take that baby, your baby goes into state custody. And so I was a person who was pregnant inside of the Mecklenburg County Jail, and I languished for many months and received no prenatal care. I was there because I was too poor to purchase my freedom from the state pretrial. And as a result of that, I took a plea that for something that, did they have the evidence? We'll never know, because I took a plea to get out, had a set of twins 5 days later, unbeknownst to anybody, because I had no prenatal care for the entire time that I was there. And so when we look at the pandemic and the lack of care that people in jails and prisons receive on a regular basis, now we are presented with COVID and not having sanitizing agents and personal protective equipment. Prior to COVID, there were 56 pregnant women in North Carolina prisons. Now there are 10 as a result of our advocacy. And those 10 we can't get out because of the system's refusal. The system has labeled these pregnant women as being violent, with no accounting for the violence of separating them from their families, for keeping them in cages in the midst of a pandemic. And so again, when we think of the system, we have to look at the system for what it doesn't want us to see it as just as violent, if not more, than the people that it seeks to rehabilitate. And the second part of your question was,
let me just give you a little feedback here, just because you made me think of something that I think would interest you. First of all, that is absolutely heartbreaking, and is clearly a violation of human rights and the dignity of women and human beings, to me. But I wanted to say that it reminded me of a colleague who's done some research, and she's also a sister, that has found that many of the prisons are built on the grounds or in the form of former slave forts, and that their techniques and even their implements for control are exactly the same, which I think is chilling. It begs the question, did we ever get out? We thought we did, but okay.
It's slavery by another name.
Yes, very it's terrifying thought, and it's a terrifying reality. Finally, could you just speak to whether our current strategies are sufficient to support those arrested in the Black Lives Matter protests that are happening, and freedom protests happening right now? I know there's been a backlash by the state. There's been something, Operation Legend, and these different things have come around the last 7 weeks. Are we able to help those movement people who are being, I guess, for lack of a better word, picked off?
Well, I know what the Charlotte has been amazing. So I was arrested on May 29th, which was the night of the first protest here in Charlotte. And when I came out for being arrested, there was a group of people waiting outside for me to welcome me back into society. And so we have created jail support that is still there to this day, that is running 24 hours a day, 365 days for people who are coming out of jail, to connect them with resources, their housing, food, there's cigarettes. You can use a phone, charge your phone, get a ride, anything you need, right? And there's a group that feeds every night called Feed the Movement. It was born out of the protests and making sure that folks who were protesting had food, had nourishment. And so that's been beautiful to watch. What we've done here also, as people who have been brutalized by the police, we have a collective of therapists who are offering their services for free and reduced pricing for people to work through their emotions and feelings about what they've witnessed and experienced. We also have pro bono attorneys who are working people's cases, criminal cases, as well as we have bail funds. So there is the North Carolina Community Bail Fund of Durham, there's the North Carolina Community Bail Fund of Charlotte, and the North Carolina Pregnancy Bail Fund, which are working, and the North Carolina Protester Bail Fund, all working together to ensure that people are getting out and that they're supported when they do come out. And so I think at the local level, we're doing really well, and we're doing well here in North Carolina to support. But what we don't have a lot of support is at the federal level. If you are picked up by the feds, you are essentially screwed, just period. I mean, so you can only, your wish is to get hope. And that's a bad wish to get picked up by CMPD as opposed to any other agency, right? But if I had my preference, I would much rather be picked up by CMPD and processed through that system, because I know what to expect. We have absolutely no faith in the justice system, the Department of Justice under William Barr and under President Trump's administration, to be quite honest. And so the rule of law no longer seems to be what this administration is following. So when we look at people that are kidnapped, because literally people are being snatched off the streets into unmarked vans and into cars. And the difference is they're not generally being held for ransom. At least here in Charlotte, if the locals pick you up, we can pay your ransom and purchase your freedom. But with the feds, there's nothing you can really do. They say you can go.
I think we might go ahead. I was going to say that's another chilling reminder of slavery, where you could sometimes buy your way out.
Oh yeah, so that's what we call it. We have to use the intentional language. It's not bail, it's ransom. And why is it ransom? Because they kidnapped you. Why they kidnapped you? Because if I had a choice, I wouldn't be here. You know what I mean? And so that's why we have to use the language to make those connections to people, so that they understand that just because you say it, frame it in a way, doesn't mean it's any less of this thing. So it's still kidnapping, it's still ransom. We're still purchasing our freedom from the state in 2020, from the government.
For those watching, that's Kristie Puckett-Williams, North Carolina ACLU, and we will hopefully, folks can share contact information or get in touch with me or this agency that's putting this on, so that we, or the two agencies, so that we can get contact information, because people may want to model things that are working in other states. And that's other states and cities, and that's what we're hoping for. Turning now to our colleagues in Minneapolis. Autumn Dillie, and again, correct me on your pronunciation of your names, because I've never formally met you guys until now. How'd I do? Autumn?
That's how you say it.
Okay, Autumn is an outreach worker, and case manager for the American Indian Community Development Corporation, with its emphasis on relieving homelessness and housing insecurity against or for the Minneapolis Native community. Can you talk about to what extent Native Americans are also suffering from police violence there in Minneapolis as well as elsewhere? And if you could also add on a bit about your, I believe you've organized community patrols in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, and what did that look like? Is that something that's been institutionalized into the American Indian Community Development Corporation, or is that something that was done alongside of it? And can it be institutionalized? How is it working? What's going on there?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. First of all, so one of the things that we know within just Minnesota alone is that Native Americans, American Indians, are 27 times more likely to be homeless than our white counterparts. So one of the things that we've done with our community safety patrol before, or pre-George Floyd's death, was we had a community safety patrol on the ground on Franklin Avenue. The reason being for that is because right now, American Indian folks are facing a really serious epidemic for opiates. And up and down Franklin Avenue, you know, we see overdoses. It's just at a really high rate. And so one of the things is when our organizations close down on Franklin Avenue, there's nobody out there. You know, the response for overdose isn't as high on the list of, you know, with policing. You know, it's not something that they're able to respond to in a fast manner. Overdose, we know, can be fatal very, very quickly. Our community safety patrol had been out there, you know, after dusk, like after the sun goes down, they're out there overnight, you know, patrolling, checking in, different doorways for folks, reversing overdoses, linking folks to different resources like myself and my outreach team. So that's kind of where the community safety patrol idea was born. And then when we get post, you know, George Floyd's murder, the civil unrest is happening. And one of the things that I'd like to put emphasis on it is that our people were grieving. When, you know, we're grieving the loss of life, you know, we watched our brother get murdered on the internet. You know, my son saw it. He's 7 years old. You know, we all saw it. And one of the things that Indian people do when we're grieving is we come together. And that's kind of where the idea of patrolling our neighborhood kind of grew from. And I can't take credit for organizing the whole entire shebang on Franklin Avenue. That was pretty much us reaching out to our different networks and us coming together. So while we're grieving, you know, we eat, we laugh, we enjoy each other's presence, and that's how we get through that. That's how Indian people get through that. One of the things that we've learned to do, you know, as far back as reservations and whatnot, is we've learned how to adjust and adapt to the situations that we're in and that the adversities that we face. So that's kind of where that grew. And then thinking about the 150 people we have in housing up and down Franklin Avenue on the Franklin corridor. And then also it's where all of our programs are. So all of our programs being housing stability, medical, chemical and mental health, and then our communities here. You know, this is where our community, folks from all over Minnesota or, you know, the Dakotas, they come here to find the urban Indian community and find their people. So it was really important for us to patrol that area to make sure we keep it safe. And so AIM Patrol was out. So and then AICDC, and we had to get an exemption for the curfews to make sure that we were able to stay out and stay taking care of our folks. It was important to have outreach workers out there because the folks that were protecting the unhoused relatives that we have, it was important for us to be there where they had somewhere to go that was safe. And they saw a familiar face. So, go ahead.
Well, I just think you brought up the response of the community to the whole person, which is important. I know now a pastor that I know said that he found out about the George Floyd, and he's a Caucasian. He found out about the George Floyd murder because his young son, I think 12 years old, ran in and told him that he just saw the police kill a man. He was he's terrified, and the fear. If you multiply that fear that's in young men and women, but young men of color, period. I mean, the fact that you responded to the whole person, leading people to resources, but also to the spiritual healing and togetherness that we need so much in those types of situations, that I don't think that that is addressed. I don't think it's addressed by anyone else. I don't believe it is. I guess I'm wondering another question about patrolling. Checking for the overdoses, working on the issues of homelessness, meeting other needs, psychological and emotional needs. Is there I'm asking because I know the Black Panther Party and some other groups used to do the patrolling the streets for police. Is it also we're out in the streets, we're sort of observing? Is there that element too, or not? That we're sort of watching or.
Yeah, I think so. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the American Indian movement that was founded in 1968. So their whole it was founded for poverty and for police brutality. So they're out there as well. They're the founding members were out there. The executive director, I think that's her name. She was out there. Frank Perro was out there. We started at 6 p.m. and we didn't go home until the sun came up.
One follow-up question. I did not know that the AIM was there. That's fantastic. And is there still that presence at all? Is there still that presence, or is there a continuation? I know that happened right after the uprising and everything, but is there still that some of that remnant presence that's sort of being built into the corporation, the American? Is there a trend that's continuing, I guess, from that experience?
We've definitely talked about it, and there's definitely other community meetings that are going on where we're strategizing how to implement this into our daily lives. Because to be completely honest, the urban Indian community still has the Little Earth protectors that are out there every single night protecting their home. They're protecting their home because right now, the response time for the police department, them not showing up, there's machines every single night, I won't say that. But they're protecting their homes. There's a vast majority of children living in the Little Earth United Tribes. And so the folks are still out there every single night.
Excellent. Okay, so we don't see I haven't seen a lot in the press about that, so that's why I was wanting to know. Excellent, really good to know. Thank you so much. Yeah, excellent. We're going to go ahead and go to Sheila. Is it Nezhad? Nezhad, thank you. Sheila Nezhad, as one of the organizers spearheading the effort to dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department, you're working with the MPD 150 project. As I understand it, it's a group of students and teachers from the Twin Cities that got together. They said, we're going to write a history, 150-year history of the police department. And that you guys started this following the killing of George Floyd and the Minneapolis uprising. And can you discuss the findings of that report? What did it show about the character of that department that had been consistent or that had changed, either one, during its 15 decades since 1867? What's happened with that?
Yeah, so just to back up a little bit, MPD 150 actually came together in 2017. And it was a group of not teachers and students. It was a group of community members, from all across the organizing spectrum. Octavia as well was part of the effort. And we came together in 2017, which was the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department, and did a people's history and people's evaluation of the Minneapolis Police Department, and came out with this fantastic report here, which you can find on our website, mpd150.com. And the conclusion of our report, and I love to read this because I think that it really sets the stage for everything that we talk about, which we talk about abolishing the police. And we say, the idea of a police-free future is neither naive nor unrealistic. It is the only pragmatic solution to the challenge of a police system rooted in the era of slavery and Indian removal, which has defeated every reform thrown at it. To believe that we are just one or two reforms away from turning the police into a trusted partner of the very communities it has treated like enemies to be conquered for a century and a half, that is the ultimate in magical thinking.
Wow.
Yeah,
I love it. Yeah. And that's why we have to talk, because I didn't realize that the press reports of this group just came up. So it's been since 2017, and it was community based, and it included teachers, but it was a community based project across the board. Very, very good. I liked especially that you put, because I've had arguments with faculty and other people that you point out that, because I'm usually talking about the police unions, but you're talking about every reform besides the union issue with the fraternity and the secrecy and all that. The defeat of every reform that's come along. I think that was a fabulous way to put it. I've never thought about it like that before. No matter what you do, it's futile because the institution itself is structured as a slave-based system from the core, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, Minnesota also rooted in Indian removal.
In Indian removal. Excellent. Wow. Can you give us any data? Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about, and I think one of your colleagues here, our colleague in North Carolina talked about it, talking about the police being the gateway. Are you seeing the same thing there? Is it mainly police killings that you guys found in the report, or are they more acting as the gateway to other harms of the system there as well? And what would that be?
Yeah, so the purpose of MPD 150 is to shift the conversation away from just being about police violence and being towards looking at a systematic view of policing and dismantling the entire system of policing. So we find it really important, and the reason I think our work has resonated with so many people from the ground up is taking an approach of hope and resilience-based organizing, because we know that it is important to speak truth about the atrocities committed by police. But when we just focus on that over and over again and not about what can come next or how can we build together as a community, it can be easy to feel defeated, to feel burnt out. And so what we have really focused on in our organizing is, we call it planting the seeds of abolition. So instead of focusing on what's police brutality, we focus on what makes you feel safe. What does it take? If you close your eyes and imagine a safe, healthy community, healthy neighborhood, what do you see? You probably see green spaces. You probably see schools. You probably see people talking to their neighbors. And when we talk about abolishing the police, that's what we mean. Because in Minneapolis and like many, many cities, for instance, in our city budget, we spend 35% of our general fund on the police department. That's $193 million.
Oh my God.
And if we spent that on housing, on resources, harm reduction resources, if we spent that on literally anything, giving the cash straight to the people, that would all make us safer than investing in policing. And in Minneapolis, we've also been the poster child for reform. So I mentioned reform earlier. As an example, a lot of people will call after murders like the murder of George Floyd for more civilian oversight. Well, in Minneapolis, we've had 5 civilian review committees, 5. And nothing has changed, right? And we like to say, yes, there is crime and violence in our communities, right? But the police have been around for 150 years and none of that has changed. So it's time for us to try something that actually works.
Well, can I ask you a question? Are you working with the city council to envision this? I mean, is this group, I guess what I'm saying, are they listening to the people as such? I was envisioning the city council, they're trying to like come up with this, on their own. They voted to defund it. The mayor is against it. So we've been kind of trying to find out from afar what's going on there. And are there conversations that are going on?
Yeah, we're also trying to find out what's going on transparently.
Okay.
The council definitely does listen to folks. The other group I'm a part of, Reclaim the Block, has worked with city council and worked to mobilize people to be able to talk to the city council. Our mayor seems to have stuck his head firmly in the sand and is convinced that maybe we can try reform and it'll work this time magically.
Super disappointing. I like that guy. I was so disappointed when I saw that.
Well, I will stop now because we're live streaming, but I will say what we've learned is not what we've learned, but what we're coming up against is the many, many, many layers of self-protection that the system has. So the union contract, right? We have to wait to change the union contract to be able to get rid of some provisions of how much officers get paid, overtime, blah, blah, blah. And then in Minneapolis, we're a charter city, so our departments are established within a city constitution, essentially. And the police are a required department. And because of, it was so interesting at the beginning talking about Charles Stenvig. So before his mayorship in 1961, the police union lobbied to put in a minimum number of police into the city charter, into the city constitution. So for every resident in Minneapolis, there has to be X number of police. And in order to change the charter, we have to go through this bureaucratic process with this unelected body that's appointed by a judge. Anyway, so it's not as simple as the city council just passing an ordinance or changing the budget, which to change 150 years of policing, we wouldn't expect it to be, right?
Let's bring Octavia Smith in here, in on this conversation. The president of the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which is a community-based nonprofit that actually pays bail for low-income individuals who cannot otherwise afford it. And in this way, I was thinking that this fund, it's like you're trying to move out the bail system. You're paying it, but in a way, it's sort of doing what some of the southern states, I think Alabama, if I can remember, or Louisiana, are trying to remove the bail system and the inequalities that it brings to bear. You're doing it differently, but it's still the same thing. Will you describe the principles underlying the work of the Minnesota Freedom Fund and why your organization believes that the bail system undermines our democracy? I want to bring in the question about the criminal justice in just a minute, as far as the racism and the policing a bit more, but I'm just wondering about the incarceration piece. How does that, the fact that people of color, low-income people, are more likely to be incarcerated, held longer, all of these things, can you explain that to us, that phenomenon, as far as how does that, what does that mean about our democracy, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just before starting, I really want to give thanks to all the other panelists. Y'all are killing it, making us proud, love the connections. I also want to give so much homage to the people of Little Earth, who I live on Franklin. They came out and protected the neighborhood. And so what Autumn is talking about is not lost on me. So yeah, we are Minnesota Freedom Fund, and we've been operating since 2017, essentially acknowledging that and striving to make sure that people understood the ways in which the current bail system, as it operates, is another form of slavery, right? We talk about the prison industrial complex. We talk about policing and the brutality that comes about it. But at the time when we had started, there weren't a lot of conversations happening within the country about the impacts and the disparate impacts, particularly on Black, Native, people of color in the jails. And so what we were finding was that overwhelmingly, folks who were under-resourced in their communities, folks who were undervalued in their communities were being over-policed, right? And that over-policing then turned into being over-jailed. And so what we had was a high population, particularly in Hennepin County, Minneapolis, and this is where the uprising took place. Particularly in Hennepin County, what we had was an overwhelmingly Black, brown, and Native, right, jail population, where we're talking about a state that has 85% white people. So the disparities in itself were there, right? And, you know, Kristie was talking about the ransom of it all. And it really is that, like, people, before the uprising, our average bail was $78. So there were people who were rotting in jail because they could not afford to buy their freedom at $78. And like the cash bail system is one that is inherently oppressive against Black, Native, people of color, right? Because, and poor people, right? It says that if you have the luxury of having extra income, then you can use that extra income to buy your freedom. But if you do not, then you stay in jail until the conclusion of your court case, or you take a plea deal. And the sad reality is that the story that Kristie shared happens all throughout the country, right? People take plea deals because they want to get out of jail, not because they are guilty. And so this narrative around, we've built the notion, or the false notion at least, of our society being built on our criminal justice system being built on the notion that people are innocent until proven guilty, overwhelmingly does not apply to Black and brown bodies. This is where we're at. And I think that for decades, centuries, folks have been living with the realities of a system that is repressive in nature and doesn't value Black and brown lives.
I want to ask you a follow-up question. And being a person of color and having family members, I've been in the situation where that I've experienced that, and it's not just the getting out, it's the food is insufficient. So providing very expensive food if you have a loved one that's inside, having to supplement their diets, phone calls for people. So if the person doesn't have money, they cannot pay, they can't communicate with their family, they're actually charging. So I guess my question, I've seen it. I guess my question for you is, you talked about over-policing, over-jailing, the money part, taking the plea deals or else staying in there. Do you see this? I know Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, was sort of like a warning. Some people, oh, I'm interested to have her come and speak. Is this a corporation? Are we living in, is all of this being drawn for profit? I mean, is this a for-profit experience that we're in, just like slavery?
I mean, absolutely. There is a very distinct correlation from slavery, Jim Crow, chain gangs, jails, prisons, right? And the realities that we are living in today. And there is this understanding that people are capitalizing off of, in the prisons, essentially, are capitalizing off of the labor of folks. And in the jails, like, it is just not even, when we had started doing our work as an organization, we have found that it costs the county and costs folks who are paying taxes more money to house people in jails than it was to just let them go. And so this is not benefiting anyone at the end of the day, but the bail bondsman company that is overly, oppressive and is predatory in their lending. There are not many people who actually benefit from this system.
I have a couple more questions, and they're just going to throw them out too. to the whole group and anyone who wants to take them. But I will say I was on a Greyhound bus one time, and it was late at night and everyone was sleeping. And I heard one of the guys go up to the driver just because he was awake. And he said, yeah, me and my friend are starting a prison in Colorado because, you know, we can make this much money. The federal government's going to send this much subsidy per person. I remember just sitting there in a rage. Like, you mean, you know, where are you going to get the people from? And the people are coming from they're not coming from his community. They were coming from brown and black communities. So that was what that was. Just want to throw out a couple more things. And these questions are you can have cross conversations. I'm really just here to stimulate the conversation. So you can kick me out of the way at any point. I'm going to throw these last two questions out. I'll say them both at once and then we talked a little bit about what's going on, how different cities are responding differently. In Minneapolis, the city council, where you are voted to defund the police, with the mayor disagreeing. Washington, D.C. Mayor Bowser has asked for an increase in funding in her budget. I don't get that. While the New York Mayor de Blasio has shifted some funds formerly allocated to police to other purposes. And as we know, the Charlotte City Council reportedly, because of pressure from Charlotte for Black Futures, has no funding for tear gas. So we're seeing a spectrum of responses by the leadership of American cities after the George Floyd murder and the people's uprising. So I guess the question is, the reforming the police. Well, I guess I'll ask the first one first. The idea of defining the police has drawn philosophical lines around these different political figures and entities, with the president on the extreme right, the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, somewhere in the center, I guess, or right of the center. And, what is the future of the defund movement in you guys' view? Does it have to continue to be grassroots if it has any hope at all? It looks like there's something that won't be ever at the federal level if the incumbent and the nominee on the other side, neither one wants it. So what's your thoughts?
I think I can take part of it, and I'd love to hear from other people.
All right, and then I have a follow-up question.
I think like part of the spirit of these conversations is that we're asking people to dream bigger, right? Like defunding the police should be a bare minimum, but dream bigger. Like what can exist outside of those realities that are present? And like to Sheila's point earlier, not focusing on like what a resilience-based narrative asks us to really focus on what are the things that we want to lean into instead of run away from. And so there's that piece. I think the other piece too is like part of the work that I would assume all of us are doing is challenging the narrative of worthiness, right? Of that pervasive throughout this country is a narrative that exists through anti-Blackness, through anti-indigeneity, through all of these things that say certain people's inherent beings are inherently criminal, right? And we are challenging that narrative in as many forms as possible. And I think that, some of the stuff that needs to happen is for folks to really dig in deep to understand that the folks, growing up in the American education system as people going to college or working their jobs, right, was one that told us in every way, shape, and form that Black lives were subpar. And so there's a lot of narrative switching and narrative changing that has to happen in order for us to get to this place where abolition is not just a word, but it's a vision and it's real.
I just want to jump in and say, and then we want to throw it out to each of you to make a closing remark, but your thinking is deepening mine, because I was going to ask, what are the next steps? Outlawing police unions, which I definitely am in favor of. Okay, of course, defunding the police and disarming them. At the same time, investigating mass incarceration and including releasing people who have been incarcerated from former social movements, as well as just the mass incarceration that's going on as a spectrum of incarceration. But you are actually taking it, all of you, to another level, in particular what Octavia just said, and her colleague as well, Sheila, you're talking about the remaking of society, not just the police. I mean, because that's what you're talking about.
Well, yeah, because we also have to own the police or kill the cop that we all have in our heads. And we have to own that we commit harm and enable others to do so. When we are trauma informed, we can accept that harm comes from history, that the world isn't split into good and bad folks, and that we all, again, have the capacity to harm. And so one of the most difficult things about reimagining a system is to just concede that we're all at different points of personal reflection regarding everything that has happened. And this makes an already difficult problem even harder because people are going through their individual processes while realizing that there are deeper structural issues that led to how we collectively have enabled this abuse. And so if we're going to imagine a world and actualize a world without police and prisons, we're going to have to do the really hard work to build our communities with trust, with infrastructures of care that will prevent the resurgence of the carceral state as a solution.
Very exciting. Final words from, let's go through everybody one last time. Final words from Tiffany Fant.
I was just to kind of close out with this statement. I like to focus on 90% building and 10% destruction, because if we focus on continuously dismantling without building, then what we would be left with. And also if we begin to build the things that we're looking for and want to be in those communities, like I forgot who gave us the close your eyes vision, but that's what we need to be doing, creating that resilience in communities, because then we begin to starve the system if we begin the communities that we want to live and breathe in, so that when we say defund the police, it's like, now this is where you put the money in this thing that we've created, that we've built, that we need to have fun. Because remember, police only show up after the crime has happened. So we're doing the work that's before. So get the money to the beforehand and not the afterhand, and we may actually see a shift in what we are looking for in society.
That's so powerful. It gives me chills. Kristie Puckett-Williams. Comments, closing comments?
Yeah. Well, my only closing comment is that we do have the capacity as a society to do better. When this country was founded in the 1700s, our forefathers had a vision, and that vision included enslaving other folks. And so if we want to, as a country, to rectify that, we're going to have to create a new vision. France has recreated itself 5 and 6 times. I don't know how many constitutions France had, and we still stuck on the same one. And so we act like we're beholden to a set of values that that no longer align with ours. So just like I won't work at a job whose values don't align with mine, why are we continuing to live in a society whose values no longer align with ours?
I love it. I need to keep y'all as friends. I need some emails when this is over. This is fantastic. Autumn Dillie. Autumn.
It's okay. The only closing comment I have is just wow. This was one of the best panels I've ever been on. We wish to everybody for sharing their magic. I know we're all tired. And then that's really all I have. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing and for sharing what's going on there, and for the information about the protectors, which is actually extremely heartening to me. Sheila, Nezhad.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I really appreciate the time to talk with all of you, and yeah, the time to unravel some of these complexities in public, right? We know that working with city councils, working with grassroots movements, working with protesters, working with jails, it's all a part of dismantling the bigger system. And a lot of the work is very confusing and honestly, like, not very sexy. So I appreciate everyone out there doing the not sexy work of dealing with the ordinances, dealing with the city council process. And I will say about defunding the police, to me and to the work and the groups I work with, defund is a tactic to get to abolition. Abolition is the goal. The overall strategy is abolition. Defund is a tactic on the way to get there. And that's because, like Tiffany was saying, it's about like 10% taking away and 90% building. And abolition, Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And that's what I tell myself.
Thank you so much. That helps to have it. Defunding
everyone.
is a tactic to get to abolition. Fabulous. Octavia Smith, can you close us out?
Yeah, there was one question, I think it'll kind of be a great way to end on, that someone asked about how do we change those narratives? And I always like to say, like, it starts, like, social justice at any space starts at home. And so this is like the internal work of really, how do we, like, do you know your neighbors? One of the questions I always ask when I facilitate a conversation is, how many people know the people that live next to them, down the hall from them, down the street? And the answer overwhelmingly is like, I don't know. I know their name. I talked to them that one time. They see me, you know, help me out once or whatever. But the work.
Did we lose you?
I guess you did. It's really.
Oh, no, come back. We missed just a piece of that. Can you just repeat that last sentence there?
The work is to have these hard conversations, and it isn't, like, to Sheila's point, it's not the sexy work. Having conversations that can turn into arguments, that can turn into more conversations, that can turn into healing is a part of that work. And you don't know people until you invite them in and ask them to share a part of themselves and being vulnerable. So I think that's like the work that lies ahead for all of us. Really, community engagement at the center is the way to shape better futures and to build.
I think her Wi-Fi is going in and out at the very end there, but I want to say that it's an honor. Are you back? Go ahead and say, you say it was a way to build. I just want to hear that last word.
I said community.
I'm so rich, I don't want to miss anything. You said it was a way to build what?
Like, I'm done. I was saying that community engagement is the method in which we build realities that don't currently exist.
Beautiful. It's almost like you guys are talking about, you know, epistemology, meaning other ways of knowing. I mean, one of the ways I come to it is womanism, but other ways of knowing besides the ways that we've been taught. Or like in my case, all I learned was diplomatic history, and then I found out, wait a minute, there's all kinds of ways of knowing, not one way that we were taught, because that was a structure we were born into. It's very liberating. It's an honor to be with all of you powerful, powerful thinkers. I really appreciate you coming on tonight. I hope that we can stay in touch and maybe do this again and communicate, bring more people aboard. Thank you so much. Thank you to Alex and the crew, to the V Museum, to the Minneapolis Historical Society, and to all of your organizations. Thank you so much, and good night. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tekla, and thank you everyone for being with us tonight. And on behalf of the Levine Museum of the New South, I just want to let everyone know that please take a look at our website, because we are continue to hold this conversation as part of the What's It Gonna Take series. You can support the museum, of course, by becoming a member. And tonight we held this a special program with the Minnesota Historical Society, and like everyone said, we hope is the first of many bringing Charlotte and Minneapolis together on different forums. And whether it's through the Levine Museum and all of your organizations and everyone out there also in your own specific groups, we hope that you can now find ways that this virtual work can actually find a way to bring us together. And the last thing that I will say is that also you can support the museum with one of our previous exhibit, No Justice, No Peace. A lot of you have been asking for those shirts, so take a look at the end where we have a short clip for you where you can see a little bit about our shirts for the Levine Museum of the New South. And thank you all for this insightful conversation. Thank you. Will we be able to find this link, or will you send that out to everybody, Alex? So this will live on our Facebook page and our YouTube page. So everyone who, I know I saw a few comments that say that they came in a little bit late. And for folks that want to share it with their friends and their networks, this will be on our website. And also it will be on the Facebook page for the Minnesota Historical Society. So the video will stay there, so you can go back for those of you that came a little bit late and share it with others. So yeah, definitely.
Kristie, I wanted to know if that's one of the twins. Is that one of the twins there?
Oh, no.
Okay.
The twins are 11 now.
All right. Well, you all, thank you so much. Good to meet everybody. And thank you, Alex. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
you.